On the borders were the Armstrongs, able men, somewhat unruly and ill to tame. Such was the description of my ancestors, the Armstrongs, the most notorious of the 77 border clans and families along the Scottish-English borders for over 300 years. Don't get the wrong idea though. These men were fierce warriors. They were known for their light cavalry ability, often sought after for mercenary work in Europe. For 300 years, they served the purpose of the crown, but were not loyal to either crown. Constant border warfare was a way of life. Raids, cattle and sheep rustling, kidnapping for ransom, protection rackets, even murder for hire was all part of the culture that was accepted for over 300 years. And although much of it illegal, it was the accepted practice and culture of the day. These men were often desperate men. Constant warfare in the borders rendered agriculture almost useless. Many times they fought and raided just for their mere survival. But they still had a well-developed way of life and still managed to carve out a living, and some even amassed some wealth and power in that 300-year period. At one point, the Armstrongs could put 3,000 men in the saddle, really a private army, but they weren't loyal to any crown. They were only loyal to kith and kin, and that created a problem. So in 1603, at the unification of the crown, when King James VI of Scotland became James I of England, we no longer served a purpose between two countries. We were a problem in the middle of a single kingdom. And at that point, many of the clan chieftains along the borders were hung, executed, tortured, imprisoned, and many were shipped to foreign countries. The Armstrongs in particular were sought out for their expert horsemanship and their ability as light cavalry, and were sent to Ulster in Ireland to pacify the king's new holdings among his Irish lands. And so he killed two birds with one stone, getting rid of his most notorious of the unruly clans, and then putting us to work to pacify his new Irish subjects. This is the story of the Border Reivers, and today we're going to be going over some of their hand weaponry, their polearms, and their arms and armor. A very highly developed culture, a little bit on the wild side, but very interesting, and had a huge impact on both Scotland and England for centuries, and for centuries after their heyday. Hope you enjoy this information. Please feel free to contact me at Armstrong Clan and Border Reivers at Celtic Classic. Celtic Classic is a wonderful and extremely large Scottish-Irish Celtic festival that's held in the last weekend in September in the Lehigh Valley of the state of Pennsylvania in the United States. We exhibited there last year as Clan Armstrong and the Border Reiver families, and managed to secure first place among all the clans and associations, and we're very proud of that. We invite you back year after year. We'll be there. We can't wait to meet our cousins. Thank you. The helmets and armor of the Border Reiver were very important to him. It was a nasty way of life. It was a harsh and violent existence. In order to inflict damage, you also need to be able to protect yourself from damage. Here's some of the implements that were used on the border. We'll start from the inside and work our way out. First, we have the arming hat. This was often used as padded armor on the head, would fill out the space between the user's skull and his helmet. When you got inevitably beat over the head with a weapon, this would help the bells to stop ringing. It provided quite a bit of cushion, very similar to the lining of a modern football helmet. A little less fancy, but equally as effective. Plate armor was hard to come by for the average reiver. Only the mightiest laird and his retainers had plate armor. Most reivers hope to have a padded jack such as this, also called a gambeson, which can be used to pad underneath plate armor, but a padded jack would often just be a heavy quilted coat filled with fabric, even straw, and was actually quite effective against sword blows and would protect the reiver from his enemy combatants. If you were rich enough and lucky enough, you had a breastplate. Heavy gauge steel. It could stop just about anything except for that wheel-lock pistol from the 16th century, which became the first firearm to be able to be loaded and hold on to wait for use without going off. Unlike a matchlock or flintlock, you did not need to have a lit fuse for a wheel lock. A wheel lock you could actually cock, use a key to rotate the wheel, and it would be ready to fire. You could tuck it in a belt or a holster on your saddle and be ready to use. That was really the only thing that could bring down a rider or a foot soldier with a breastplate such as this. The head is perhaps the most vulnerable place when you're in steel combat. And so there were several different types of helmets that the Border Reivers used. And the vernacular term for Border Reiver was the steel bonnets, kind of the slang term of the day. And they were called the steel bonnets for the heavy steel helmets that they wore into battle and while on raids. Perhaps one of the most famous is the open-faced Bourgeois. I've mentioned previously that they were very sought after for their mercenary abilities, and so for the day they were quite well traveled, with many of the Border Reivers traveling into Europe temporarily to serve as mercenaries. The open-faced Bourgeois is a French design and became very popular because of its ability to protect the user's face, as well as his neck and glancing blows off the helmet. Very effective. Common foot soldier would often use a helmet called a kettle helmet, and this was in wide use from the 13th to the 16th centuries throughout Europe. It was easy to come by, relatively cheap, and provided quite a bit of protection with a visor 360 degrees around the entire helmet. And the quintessential Border Reiver helmet, the steel bonnet, is the combed moran. Originally a Spanish design, this is the comb and provides excellent glancing defense for any long polearm or sword coming down on a helmet. Will automatically deflect it off to the side. Very effective, not terribly expensive, and really symbolized the Border Reiver era. Finally, we have shields of the day. The Scottish targe is perhaps one of the most symbolic pieces of defensive weaponry from the era. This one was made in Edinburgh. It's got genuine Scottish stag, leather over wood with brass inlay. It's very well made, provides excellent protection, and again is a symbol of Scotsmen throughout the entire region. A little later in the Border Reiver era, in the 16th century, the steel buckler became much more effective, easier to make. Didn't take quite nearly as much craftsmanship as a good targe, and a bit sturdier being that it was made out of steel. This was also frequently used throughout northern England and into Scotland, but very effective, particularly in combination with a sword. Constant warfare on the border was just a reality of life, from the English invasion of 1296 all the way to the unification of the crowns in 1603 and beyond. The reiver needed to have the implements of his trade, and that was warfare and raids. With the 300+ year history, the evolution of weaponry developed along with the reiver culture. Early on, simple farm implements would be used, such as a bearded axe, a little nod to the head of the heritage of many of the reivers, which were grounded in Danish Viking invasions from several centuries earlier. A simple farm implement like this, used properly, can become a very lethal weapon. With Otterburn and Bannockburn and the Burns battles as we call them, more medieval style warfare came into play, and the reivers played their part. The bastard sword or hand and a half sword was the weapon of choice. A large sword, sharp on two edges, it dealt crushing blows on the battlefield and saw many reivers both fall and get home. The high point in the 16th century, where reiver culture really developed, and they started to accumulate some significant wealth in some cases, the basket hilt broadsword was the weapon of choice. A broadsword has two edges. A basket-hilled backsword has one edge, more for slashing. The broadsword could both be a stabber and a slasher, and the groove here was actually what's called a blood groove and would provide a release on the suction should you run a man through and have to pull your sword out. Along with the broadsword often came a dagger, a parrying dagger such as this. These implements were made based on an actual set found in the borders around 1590. So the heyday of the Armstrong clan and many of the Reiver clans at the height of their power, these swords are both period and geographically accurate. As we reached the end of the Reiver era, things became a little more refined, particularly for some of the wealthier Reivers, and the rapier came into play. The Reivers had a lot of forays as mercenaries into Europe and brought back a lot of steel, particularly from Germany and Spain, that they favored. The wire hilt rapier was a stabbing sword, thinner blade, and a little more refined, but equally as lethal as the rest. And finally, kind of the mainstay of the border was known as the bollock dagger. I'll leave it up to you to discover why, but it resembles a certain part of the male anatomy and a certain slang term for it. But the bollock dagger was a standard weapon for any good borderman. It was used for both combat and for cutting your dinner. These are just some of the hand weapons that Border Reivers used during their 300 plus history. The common reaving foot soldier was often left to his own devices to arm and equip himself. If he was lucky, he would have a padded jack or a gambeson such as this, a steel kettle helmet, which were readily available and relatively inexpensive, and a pole arm along with his bollock dagger for his last resort. One of the pole arms very specific to Scotland is the Lochaber axe. Approximately 5 feet long, it was an absolutely devastating weapon that was used to first unhorse an opponent using this billhook. It could also stab an incoming horse or rider. Finally, once the rider was on the ground, you could use the crushing axe blade to come down and crush your opponent. Very brutal weapon, particular to Scotland, and one that really came into its own during the Reiver era. No Reivers without his lang spear or long spear. Approximately 7 feet long, it was used by both mounted Reivers and dismounted soldiers for all sorts of close quarters combat, and also as a defense against incoming horse. Finally, as we developed in the 15th and 16th century, various polearms came into use, such as this halberd. Similar to the Lochaber axe, it had a bill hook that could both hook, a spike which could stab, and an axe head that could render a crushing blow once you dismounted your opponent. Polearms varied wildly. There was a lot of different types during the Border Reiver era in both northern England and Scotland. Some of them were farm implements, other ones forged, and many brought back from mercenary work in